Hey, today I'm going to look at Game 4 between Garry Kasparov and Deep Blue in the 1997 match, Man vs Machine. And here Deep Blue is white, Garry Kasparov is black. Deep Blue kicks off with 1e4, Kasparov plays c6, possibly hinting that he's going to go towards a Caro-Kann. So d4, but no, he now plays d6, another little pawn move, possibly trying to get Deep Blue out of the opening book as was his plan previously. Knight f3 from Deep Blue, Knight f6, black attacks this pawn on e4, Knight c3, defends it, Bishop g4. Now the usual idea behind this black opening is to get the bishop out and possibly play e6, d5, and black's got a really solid game. Can probably play g6 as well, bishop g7 or bishop to e7. So here Deep Blue plays h3, bishop h5, bishop d3 now, and now Kasparov plays 1e6, going for this plan most likely. Here Deep Blue could play g4 attacking the bishop, and this variation would go something like bishop g6, g5 perhaps, knight f7, d5, and white just develops the bishop to f4, the bishop comes to e7, and after queen d2, knight a6, h4, and maybe bishop h5 and bishop e2. White's got a slight edge, has a space advantage, and will probably castle queenside and unleash the f-pawn at stun point and maybe try for a pawn storm, but there's still a lot to play for. Deep Blue actually played queen to e2 here, reinforcing the centre, maybe threatening to push e5 or d5 with the queen eyeing up the black king. So for this reason, Kasparov played d5 here to strike in the centre. Bishop g5 from Deep Blue, a normal move, and bishop e7 from Kasparov. D takes e4 is also possible here, but after knight takes, knight bd7 perhaps, and castling queenside. The game continues quite the same with bishop e7, maybe g4, bishop g6, and taking the knights. But here white could play h4, maybe queen c7, and after takes, and a few captures. After knight e5, white stands reasonably well, so it makes more sense just to leave the tension in position. So bishop e7 is fine. e5 was played by Deep Blue, attacking the knight, and it was forced to move away. So bishop takes e7, queen takes e7, g4, bishop g6 from Kasparov, and now Deep Blue takes on g6, swapping the bishops. H takes, this opens a rook up to the file. After h4, and this is quite interesting because both pairs of bishops have been swapped off. You don't get many games like this. It's knights versus knights. Kasparov played knight a6 here. Knight b6 is also possible, trying to get into the c4 square. But after b3, knight a6 is similar to the game. So knight a6, castles queenside, rook dg1, trying to get the heavy pieces behind these two pawns and possibly try and open them up. Knight c7 was played, king b1, and now I think this was a pretty good move because he's got to strike in the centre. Kasparov played f6, striking in the centre against e5. E takes f6, now queen takes. I was thinking g takes here, and I guess the reason why he didn't do it was because after h5, g takes, maybe after e5 striking back in the centre. White still does have a pass pawn, so, and after something like knight h4, queen h7, knight g6, rook h to e8 and queen d3, e4, queen e3, white stands better, slightly better. The pass pawn is probably too strong and black does need to be careful, so for this reason I guess queen takes was the accurate move here. Rook g3, maybe supporting the knight in f3 and scoping ideas to do a rook lift at a later date. Rook d8 supporting the e6 pawn. Now black needs to get rid of this e6 pawn as soon as possible. It's the weakness in his position. So we'll see in a few moves Kasparov plays e5 and gets rid of this weakness even if he sacrifices it. Rook e1, white's doing the right thing, he wants to get into e5. Rook h, f8. What Kasparov is doing now is attacking this f2 pawn. So knight d1 supports this, And now white is free to move this f3 knight. Now here, if black opts to not push the e5 pawn, he could play knight b5. After c3, knight d6, black's jumping into these white squares. Maybe after knight g5, rook h8, attacking the pawn, rook f3, and queen d8. If knight takes e6, queen takes h4, we have a pawn trade. Rook e3, knight c4, maybe knight takes g7. We're getting to this computer variation, and it's still quite even. So other moves were possible, but Kasparov actually decides to play e5 here, giving up the pawn. So after d takes e5, Kasparov plays queen f4, trying to gain more activity for his pieces, and the idea is to blockade on e6 and gain some activity. After a3, knight e6 is played, preparing to jump into c5 with the d knight. Now I think actually a good move for white here is b4, preventing c5, knight c5. Instead, knight c3 was played by deep blue. Knight dc5 from Kasparov, and now b4, kicking the knight away. Knight d7 jumps back, and queen d3, eyeing up this g6 pawn. So queen f7 protects it, and now b5, trying to undermine this d5 pawn by attacking the defender on c6. But now after b4, c5 is free again, so Kasparov jumps back in. Queen e3, and queen f4. We were back where we were, but now the knight's on c5, and that b pawn is pushed really far away. So b takes c6, b takes c6, and rook d1, possibly preventing any d4 ideas. King c7, unleashing these two rooks onto the b file. King a1, white was prepared for this. And here Kasparov actually swapped queens off. I was wondering what would happen if he played rook to e7 instead. And if white avoids the exchange, we could continue with something like queen c4, maybe queen e3, rook f4. And after knight g5, king c8, knight takes, knight takes, knight a2 perhaps, and a5. I think black actually stands a bit better because the rook can come into b7, and possibly could start trying to push these two pawns up, and black has the fourth rank secure with the rook on f4, and the pawn on e5 is also blockaded. So I actually prefer black's position here. In the game that Kasparov took on e3, f takes, which is still a good move because it doubles these two pawns. So rook f7, rook h3, and rook ef8 attacking the knight on f3. So it moves to d4, and rook f2 from Kasparov, attacking the pawn on c2. Rook b1 was played by white, so he gains the open file. And now rook g2 attacking this g pawn. Knight e2 was played, reinforcing the d4 knight, and maybe jumping into f4 at some point. I was wondering what would happen here because, right, Kasparov played rook takes g4, gaining the pawn back, but I think a superior move is just rook ff2. So we're threatening to take this knight on e2, and we're also eyeing up a2, threatening mate. So black is actually threatening to take the knight and gain two pieces for the rook. So here if knight takes e6 check, knight takes e6, knight d4, black can just recapture the knight, rook takes c2, and I think black's winning here because if rook e1, trying to get the passed pawn, we can play around a bit. Rook a2, king b1, rook gb2, king c1, check. And if king d1, which is actually a mistake, black can play rook to g2, and we're threatening mate on a1. The only move is rook c3, and we can take the g pawn now, and we're threatening all these other pawns. And we don't need to worry about this pass pawn because the king can just intercept at a later date. And even after king b1 in this position, rook a b2, rook a1, king d7, black's got a draw if he wants it. He can always perpetual check the king, but play could continue. So I think here rook ff2 was really good. Instead rook takes g4 was played, and deep blue took on e6, recaptures, knight d4, recaptures, takes back, and white wins the pawn back with rook takes d4. And now we're into quite an interesting rook endgame. So deep blue goes straight after the double G pawns, wisely. And rook c4, attacking the pawn on c2 for black. Rook takes, rook takes, rook takes g7, king b6. And as a result of that, now white actually has a pass to h pawn. So black's got to be a bit careful. Rook b3 check from deep blue, king c5, rook takes a7. So white's trying to clear the board here. The good thing is that black's two pawns are connected, so they're quite strong together, whereas whites are all really isolated, so they can easily be picked off by these two rooks. Rook f1 check, rook b1 was forced, and now rook ff2, rook b4 to give the king some space, and we repeat some moves. Rook c1 check, rook b1, rook to c2, rook to b4, check, rook to b1, and now Kasparov changes it up. So he could have played rook c2, probably going for perpetual. So what rook c2 does is actually threaten mate on a2. So after rook b4, check, rook's forced to block it, and here Kasparov decides to break the perpetual with rook takes b1, king takes b1 and rook e2, attacking the pawn on e5. Rook e7 defends it, rook h2 attacking another pawn, rook h7 defends the other pawn, king c4 from Kasparov, rook c7 which attacks the c pawn, so c5 is played to push it up, and now e6, white's trying to get a queen with one of these pawns. Kasparov takes on h4, and after e7, rook e4. So we've got the rook behind the pawn, so this is not going anywhere at the moment, and there's no way for white to get this pawn past. But here deep blue plays a4 and king b3 and king c1. A draw was actually agreed, which surprised me because I thought black could continue, but it becomes obvious it is a draw. For instance here, if Kasparov takes an a4, rook takes c5, rook takes c7, rook takes d5 is a simple draw. But what happens if Kasparov pushes to c4? That's what I was thinking. So after c4, white can actually play a5, trying to get a queen. And if c3, black's threatening mate, so king d1 is forced. And now if something like d4, a6 can be played by white. And if d3, amazingly a7 can be played. And if black now plays d2, threatening rook to e1 mate, white's rook is really far away on the 7th rank, so it has the ability to now start checking the king. So after rook b7, king c4, black keeps the threat of rook e1, and then king c2, rook c1 checkmate. So white can play king c2. If the king decides to go to the a file, a8, queen would just be played. So king c4, king c2, rook e1, threatening d1 check and leads to mate. So white just has to continue checking. Rook c7, king b4, rook b7, king c4, rook c7. And if black ever moves his king forward, like say to b4 or d4, let's say b4, the threat of rook c1 no longer exists because the king can escape to b3, and this black king isn't covering these squares anymore where it was doing. And it's a simple win for white if the king moves forward that way, because now white can just play rook to d7, which eliminates the possibility of d1 with a queen, and white will queen themselves with this pawn here. So for that reason, after we get to a position like this and rook c7, it's just a draw because black can just move from side to side, maintaining this checkmate or queening, and if the king ever moves up, rook d7 puts an end to white's plans. And if black tries king b5, white just wins with rook d7, because after king c4 trying to get this attack back, white can actually just sacrifice, and after rook takes e7 we get into this endgame where white should be able to convert. After all, white is a computer. Anyway, so the draw was agreed on this position, and again Kasparov used a very unusual opening to try and deal with deep blue. I hope you enjoyed the video and learnt something. I'll be back with game 5 very soon. Thanks for watching.